The Mayo Experience.
Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Experience.
Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience, continuing our coverage of the 2018 fantasy football season. If you want to check out the PME draft kit, go to facebook.com/thepme or just look at the description of the show. All the shows are in there. You can find the whole rankings, the debates, everything you need to know heading into the season so far, but we got plenty more to come. Remember to give the episode a like and subscribe to the audio version of the podcast if you want to bring us around in your pocket. If you're in transit, you can listen to it. Don't be afraid to give a review either. Today, TJ Hernandez from 4for4.com is talking statistical stability each year at each position and potential touchdown regression. TJ, what's up?
Pat, what's up, buddy? Good to be back. I haven't talked to you in a while, and this is the time of year when I get reacquainted with all my old pals, so it's good to see you again, man.
Yeah, well, unlike you, I keep an eye on what's going on football-wise all throughout the season, but I got golf, I got UFC, I got reality TV to watch over here. You, sir, are the one who's doing the heavy lifting 12 months a year.
Yeah, trying to. All the other sports, I'm just kind of a dumb fan, which is actually quite fun, but as football goes, I'm in it year round, man.
So just right off the top, before we get into everything so far, what are the few things that you've noticed from doing a ton of best ball drafts, digging into the research, keeping up on everything? Any one or two players that people are overlooking so far?
Yeah, I think if we looked at it from a zoomed out point of view, more than years past, especially recently, we see running backs flying off the board, but what's that going to do? It's going to open up some wide receiver values, obviously, especially those top guys that you often see going in the top half of the first round are slipping down into second, sometimes even third rounds. AJ Green going at the 2-3 turn sometimes. And then because people are taking running back so early, ignoring a lot of those middle round guys. The Rex Burkheads and the Chris Thompsons are guys that really stand out to me if you're playing in those PPR leagues and taking some of those wide receiver values early.
Yeah, you could theoretically, if you picked at the very top of the draft, like 1, 2, or 3, you could start your drafts. Let's say David Johnson. Let's say you get pick 3. You could take David Johnson. You could take AJ Green. You could take Doug Baldwin. Then you could take like Alex Collins and Rex Burkhead. You're off to a pretty good start in a PPR league.
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of flexibility in drafts, and anytime the crowd's going really heavy one way, which I mentioned we see it this year going really heavy at running back, there's a lot of opportunity to zig when others zag, and I think that's how you win leagues, especially if you're playing in these big high-stakes tournaments. If you can find a way to really go against the public, that's when it's really fun.
All right, let's talk about each position. We'll start with quarterbacks and see some year-over-year trends. First of all, when it comes to actually drafting quarterbacks in a redraft setting, like because some people will say, don't take a quarterback till the last round, and other people are like, that's stupid. That's what everyone says to do. I want to take one in the second round. I think that's a bit ludicrous. I'm somewhere in the middle, as I discussed on my quarterbacks rankings debate show, that like if one of these top-end guys, I have like Wilson, I have Aaron Rodgers as my top 2 guys, if people are just like, hey, we're going to punt quarterback and wait, and these guys dropped like the 5th round, I'm like, yeah, you know what? They're very good. I have them at the top of my rankings. I may as well take them there. Other than that, I probably am someone who's going to wait. But in terms of where you would actually draft a quarterback, what's the earliest you can see it happening?
Yeah, even if the Aaron Rodgers of the world are like in the 5th round, there's still skill position players that I think are going to be potential league winners over a quarterback, just because quarterback scoring so flat unless you have some kind of crazy rule in your league. But where I'm looking to grab a quarterback, if I don't wait till the very end, which I usually do, that Cam Newton, Drew Brees range, if they're dropping to like the 9th round, it's really hard for me to pass. Now, I've seen that happen quite a few times, especially if you are in a league where your league mates are particularly late round quarterback heavy drafters. Then when those guys fall, Cam has such a high floor, and even though he's not particularly a great passer, he's a great fantasy guy. So when he's there in that 8th, 9th turn, it's really hard to pass up.
All right, so what are you seeing in terms of year-over-year trends at quarterback? What should we really be focusing on?
Yeah, so I run these year-to-year correlations every year, and there are some constraints looking at quarterbacks that stay on the same team that have a minimum number of pass attempts. But The stat that's the most sticky for quarterbacks is rushing yards, but there's a pretty big caveat there. Most quarterbacks are rushing for almost no yards, so the correlation of 0 from one year to the next is going to be very high. But when we start looking at some of these guys that do rush the ball a little bit more, when we get up to those 200, 300-yard guys, their year-over-year stickiness in terms of rushing yards is actually it varies pretty widely from year to year. So yes, the Cams and the Tyrod Taylors, they're going to rush a lot, but it's really hard to predict. Is it going to be for 250 yards or 500 yards? So we actually see a lot of variance from year to year with those guys.
Well, how much of that plays into like rushing touchdowns as well? Because you see someone like Dak, who is not going to lead the league in rushing yards in terms of a quarterback, but he could lead the league in terms of rushing touchdowns from quarterback. Kirk Cousins is another one who doesn't run all that often, yet seems to call his own number around the goal line a bunch. Like when it comes to like rushing TD, positive or negative regression in terms of quarterbacks, is that something that can be predictable, or is that just something that's so highly variant that you just never would look at it?
It could be predictable in terms of which quarterbacks are going to score the most. Like you mentioned, the Kirk Cousins, the Alex Smiths, the Cam Newtons, they're going to have the most opportunities around the goal line. Projecting how many they actually score, that's where it gets a little tricky, and that's why we see something like points scored has quite a bit of variability when it comes to quarterbacks. But what we can look at, which is very sticky, is their yardage and their passing attempts. So those points aren't going to necessarily carry over from year to year, but if we can project their yardage and their passing attempts, which tends to be very sticky, then we can go out from there, look at something like passing touchdown expectation, and that's where we could get a pretty good idea based on those yardage totals of how these quarterbacks are going to regress either positively or negatively.
So what do we do with someone like Drew Brees, who seemingly went off of his baseline last year, at least in terms of overall fantasy points, because the attempts were just down from other years? Is that a trend that you think continues, or do the Saints get back to a more pass-heavy game? Because I always think that for the first time, I think since Drew Brees has been in New Orleans, their defense was like, and it should be fine again this year. They're playing with leads. They can actually run the ball because of this awesome offensive line. Do you see his number of attempts staying down, or is that hot back up?
Yeah, I think Drew Brees is a really interesting case because, like I said, these stats that I'm using to look at how sticky things are, they're just a proxy, and then we kind of want to take these case-by-case basis. Saints, you mentioned their defense. They played well, but they also played well over their head in terms of turnovers. That gave them a lot of good field position, a lot of good game script. And then if we look at just their passing rate numbers, really down for any Sean Payton offense, I think that had a lot to do with, you mentioned, a lot of really good game script. And I think just naturally their offense is going to have to regress. They scored at such a high rate, had so many big plays with Kamara in the backfield. And they also just didn't have a number 2 to throw to after Michael Thomas. I think having a healthy Cam Meredith in there, I think he's going to be a really sneaky number 2, and I think that probably boosts their pass attempts a little bit more closer to what we've expected, as well as with them probably just not being in as great of game script because their defense did play a little bit over their head. I still think they're good, but I don't know if they're exactly what we saw last year.
So if everyone wants to go check out your year over year and look at these numbers, you can go to 4for4.com and find it up there, right?
Sure, 4for4.com. I've done a full series all month. All the quarterbacks, all the wide receivers, all the tight ends that I've talked about that could be regressing, and the running backs will be coming out later next week.
So let's talk about TD regression as it pertains to quarterbacks. Just from looking at the numbers in general, just an overview, a very macro type of look at quarterbacks, it really seems like the two guys I can find, Matt Ryan and Marcus Mariota, seem to be the two that should project to throw for more touchdowns this year.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it from a little different perspective, just because so many of touchdowns from any position happen in the red zone. So I'm particularly looking at how many points each player should have scored based on where their attempts or targets happened in the red zone, and then compare that to league averages. But I am also looking at overall touchdown rates. The Falcons, you mentioned Matt Ryan, that's just an offense that should regress as a whole. So anybody on that team, we should expect some more touchdown numbers. They rank third in percentage of drives that made it to the red zone, but just 12th in drives that ended in a touchdown. So we should see that touchdown number bounce back a little bit. Offensive efficiencies usually pretty sticky, whereas touchdowns are not. Mariota, not only did he underperform in the red zone, underperform in terms of touchdown rate, but they're getting a really big infusion in their offense with Matt LaFleur coming in, Mike Mularkey going out. So we're going to see a lot more 3 wide receiver sets, a lot more play action, where Mariota was his pass attempts on play action were much more efficient. I think his quarterback rating was about 50 points higher on play action versus non-play action plays, but only about 20% of their pass attempts were play action, where Matt LaFleur ran an offense with Jared Goff last year where they were around the 30% mark, which was third highest in the league. So a lot of positive things coming from Mariota, not just because of natural regression, but because of change of philosophy.
Any other quarterbacks you think that may have underperformed last season that you can see having a big boost in 2018?
Chargers are another team that moved the ball really well, but had trouble punching it into the end zone. So I really like Phillip Rivers. Obviously, Hunter Henry going down is going to thwart some of that upside a little bit, but I still think they have a really nice receiving core with Keenan Allen, with both of the Williams guys. And Rivers has just generally been a very efficient touchdown scorer. He wasn't last year, so I like that offense to bounce back a little bit. And then I talked about Mariota with a new offensive coordinator. Mitchell Trubisky in the Bears offense with new weapons, new head coach. Matt Nagy ran a really efficient offense in Kansas City, and I think he's going to bring a lot of those concepts over to the Bears. So those two guys stand out as well.
I hear a lot about this in terms of Trubisky of, this is year 2. How much is that predicated on watching Sean McVay take Jared Goff and turn him into a usable quarterback in the NFL that puts up some decent stats? And we talk about Nagy going to Chicago, and the same thing's going to happen with Trubisky. Are we just remembering that from last year and applying it to Trubisky, even though, one of the reasons that Alex Smith was able to take a leap last year is that there's incredible talent in the Kansas City offense. I don't think that talent in Chicago quite matches that.
I would disagree a little bit. I'm probably higher on Allen Robinson than almost anyone in the world. I think he's shown and has the ability to be in that top 5 or 6 wide receiver tier, and I think having an awesome red zone weapon like that can really boost a quarterback's efficiency. I think someone like Tariq Cohen was really underutilized and misutilized last year, and I think we could see someone like Matt Nagy really maximize the efficiency of a player like that. Trey Burton is still a little bit to be determined if he is what everybody's hoping he is, but at the very least, we've seen an infusion of talent compared to what the Bears had last year. So, we're kind of looking at the parallels of the Matt Nagy and the Sean McVay, but also they went out of their way to bring in weapons around Mariota. So I'm pretty happy with their talent, and I'm still going to ride that Trubisky train. He's probably one of my highest owned quarterbacks in best ball this year.
So, but let's say you were playing in a redraft league. Is Trubisky draftable in that, like a 12-team league?
Yeah, if it's a 12-team, 16-rounder, there's a lot of flexibility in what you could do in quarterback. Oftentimes, I'm going to be the last person to draft a quarterback in those type of leagues. And if 11 quarterbacks go off the board, I don't think you necessarily have to take Trubisky, but the difference between, say, quarterback 10 and quarterback 20 this year is so slim that you could kind of take your pick of any of those guys. And if it doesn't work out, you just drop them and pick someone else up off the waiver wire.
You mentioned Burton. Everyone's giving Burton a ton of buzz this year because you just slide him to the Travis Kelce role and boom, he'll just be 80% Travis Kelce. If that's the case, he's probably not going high enough at tight end right now, but he's sneaking and inching his way near like the top 5 in terms of ADP. I think by the time we get to the end of August, that he's going to be it'll be like pick between Burton or Jimmy Graham, and You know, I might actually take Burton over Jimmy Graham. I have Jimmy Graham ranked slightly higher right now, but that's just pure touchdown upside. I'm not actually a believer in necessarily the talent of where Jimmy Graham is at right now, but, you know, he could score 17 touchdowns. Who knows with him? With Burton, is there a point where he just gets too much helium, that he's going too highly in drafts, that you just say, screw it, I pass?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a numbers game in terms of supply and demand. That tight end position, most leagues, you're only starting one. Usually it's the first player dropped when waiver wires come. So I'm not necessarily someone that's going to invest in the position in general unless I get those top three guys. I'm not investing very highly. I'm trying to wait till those double-digit rounds, just because you're going to win your league by filling out that flex position. So it's not necessarily that I don't rate Trey Burton higher than some of these tight ends. I agree. I think he does have top 5 potential, but I think from a draft equity standpoint, it's usually not a winning strategy to be going after tight ends in that range.
All right, so at quarterback, who were the ones that overachieved last season that could negatively regress back to just their basic career averages?
Yeah, I think a guy that we kind of touched on Sean McVay, Jared Goff kind of popped a little more than we expected last year. That offense was efficient, but they scored touchdowns at a ridiculously efficient rate. And then someone else who just played way over their head in terms of deep ball touchdown rate, fantasy points scored, Alex Smith. And Alex Smith is playing on a new team with a new offense, new coach. He's one that we could have, I want to say worries, because he has a really high floor, but that ceiling, I think we saw his absolute ceiling last year. So again, I talked about quarterbacks in that 10 to 20 range, pretty interchangeable. So I don't know if I'm necessarily grabbing either of those guys right now.
Okay, let's move on to running back. What do you think are the most predictive things to look at in terms of running back? Besides, I assume it would be just being on the field, volume and snap count. Anyone playing over 70% of the snaps of their team's offensive snaps and garnering close to 300 touches are just going to be top 10 running backs.
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much hit the nail on the head. There's going to be a little bit of variability when it comes to these other skill positions outside of running back and what stats we should be looking at. But when it comes to running back, the most sticky things are attempts, targets, and touches. And because most people know this, it doesn't leave a lot of meat on the bone in terms of what we can exploit in draft position. If somebody knows that a running back's going to be a bell cow, even the most casual players know to go after those guys. But I think probably where you can exploit this is in those targets, especially if you're playing in PPR leagues. We know that players tend to maintain their role at running back if they do stay on the same team. So even if the backfield looks a little bit muddy, if a team is willing to hold on to a player that had a very defined role at the running back position, usually that running back's going to maintain that role the following year.
So what do we make of someone like, let's say, Chris Thompson coming back from injury? Then the Redskins go out and draft Darius Geis. It does seem like Chris Thompson is just going to go back to the role that he had. Third down guy, if they're down in games and 2-minute drill, he's going to be on the field catching the passes out of the backfield. And if that continues to be his role, what does that mean for Geis in terms of his upside?
I think Geis' upside is very limited. I think it's very telling when a coach comes out and says something that's negative about a player. Usually we hear coaches propping up their players. It's hard to sift through the coach speak. But when a coach like Gruden comes out and says, Thompson's locked into this third down role, Geis is the first and second down guy, I mean, that's pretty telling. He's telling you that he wants to do what they've been doing in the past. Chris Thompson was on pace to have a 17% target share in that offense. That's a target share that only a handful of players at the running back position have seen in the last 10 years. So even if his efficiency drops, which it's almost surely going to happen, Chris Thompson is going to be a target monster. And if you're in PPR leagues, that's the running back you want. You're getting him at half the price of what you're going to have to pay for Darius Geis.
When we talk about market share in terms of targets in a team's offense, which running backs rate out really highly there? I'm trying to think out of the top of my head that Le'Veon probably gets a ton. David Johnson will return to getting a ton. Chris Thompson. Theo Riddick is probably another. Tariq Cohen out of the backfield, although that may change now that Chicago, like you mentioned, has increased weapons in the passing game. Are those the names that you're really looking at there, or is there other names that can just pop up?
Yeah, if you look at it on a season-long level, it's a little tough to parse out just because so many guys get injured. A lot of guys take over roles later in the year. But another one that stood out down the stretch was Dion Lewis. He was starting to approach 50% target share. I think we can see that, again, going back to that new offense in Tennessee with Matt LaFleur, who doubled Todd Gurley's targets the first year he came into that offense. Probably Dion Lewis is another one that could have a really big role in an offense that I think is going to be passing a lot more than they were in the exotic smash mouth.
So what do we do with Todd Gurley then? If the guy that was the one getting him all the targets left and goes to Tennessee, can you see regression in his market share in terms of the passing game?
I think probably he maintains his role because Sean McVay obviously had a lot to do with that as well. Brandon Cooks is a guy that I think he's going to command quite a few more targets than Sammy Watkins did. Sammy Watkins was decent because he scored a lot of touchdowns last year, but they weren't necessarily forcing him the ball. Still, this offense with Cooks, Woods, Kupp, and Gurley, the targets are going to be spread pretty thin. But relative to other running backs, I think we could be pretty confident that Gurley is going to see enough targets to be near the top of his counterparts at his position, where those pass catchers, it could be spread a little bit thin. So I guess in terms of relative to positional value, Gurley's probably the safest bet in that offense.
So when we talk about guys like Cohen and specialists, so if Thompson hurts the overall upside of Geis, I'd have to think that Cohen really kind of caps the ceiling that Jordan Howard can have.
I'm really, really back and forth on how to handle this backfield because if I like Trubisky and I like their weapons, that means that they're going to be theoretically in a lot of positive scoring situations, which should mean more red zone touches for Jordan Howard, kind of similar to what I talked about with Mariota. Play action, shotgun are spots where this offense was really efficient last year, but didn't get a lot of opportunity because they were stuck in this John Fox system. But at the same time, I don't know how good this team is going to be in real life. Are they going to have that many positive game script situations where they can keep Jordan Howard on the field? Matt Nagy keeps saying that he can catch the ball, but he hasn't proven it. Only 9% of his career touches have been through the air, which ranks around 45th or 46th of all running backs with at least 200 touches since Howard became a rookie. If they're a negative game script, you have to think Cohen's going to be the guy that's getting the usage. So my concern there isn't so much Howard or the offense, but is this team even going to be good yet?
Who are the other running backs like Howard that just garner almost no percentage of their touches through receptions?
Jay Ajayi's number was pretty low. It's still a little bit to be determined what we're going to see in that offense in terms of the running back position. I think Clement's a guy that's starting to get a little bit of traction from the fantasy world. And we just saw running back touches spread a little bit thin last year. I mean, they had a few backs that they gave the ball to, and then we got Darren Sproles back in that offense who's going to steal some touches as well. And then I already talked about Dion Lewis. I think there's a chance that not even just those pass catching roles, but just the starting running back spot. I don't know how much they want to use Derrick Henry in those passing situations. So I'm a little bit concerned about Henry, especially because he's going relatively higher than some of these other players that don't have the versatility at running back.
All right, so in terms of regression from last season that someone might drop back to career norms, who are some potential positive and negative regression candidates at running back?
Yeah, I touched on Chris Thompson. I do like him a lot because of his role, but he really did outperform expected efficiency. His touchdown numbers were through the roof. And then the most obvious one, but a guy that I'm just not drafting a lot, is Alvin Kamara. His touchdown rates, his yards per touch rates, they were at an all-time high, some of the highest we've seen, not just the past 10 years, but since the merger. And again, I've talked about coach speak, and if they say something negative, Sean Payton's come out and said that he doesn't want Kamara to be a 300 touch guy. At running back, we have to bet on volume. I mentioned that they have a bona fide number 2. He is explosive, but I don't know that he can maintain what he did last year. And if I'm paying a first round price for a running back that maybe is going to see 220 touches, that's asking a lot.
So how do you factor in rookies coming into situations like Saquon Barkley? Obviously, they use a lot of draft capital to go get him. I think that's pretty safe to say with the number 2 pick in the draft. Does that mean that he's a 3-down guy, or if they went out and they signed Jonathan Stewart? Is it going to be like, hey, Saquon, get us to the 5 here, Jonathan Stewart. We're going to give you a chance to rush it in and watch you fail 3 times in a row.
I think we have to look at historical comps when it comes to situations like this. Running backs drafted in the top 10 that stay healthy tend to approach that 300 touch number. I think that, like you said, draft capital tells us so much about player usage that the Giants with Pat Shurmur, they're not a forward-thinking offense, which can probably hurt their overall efficiency. But where we can take advantage of that is they're going to try to establish the run, which is a horrible thing to do in real football, but at least we know that we're going to get a running back that is going to see a huge amount of volume. Most recently, we've seen Zeke, we've seen Leonard Fournette. I think Giants are going to do the same thing with Saquon Barkley. I'm taking Saquon Barkley over Alvin Kamara.
So what are we doing at wide receiver when it comes to year-to-year stability? I would think market share and target share of the team's offense is the number 1 predictor.
Yeah, targets, receptions tend to be the most sticky. One stat that it's kind of new. A lot of people are just kind of getting privy to air yards, but average depth of target is one that has shown to be as sticky as any other stat. And that's really important because Josh Hermsmeyer, a guy over at 444 that does some great work for us, he's ran the numbers and found that because average depth of target is so sticky, we can actually use it to predict yardage totals very accurately, more accurately than almost any other stat for any position. And again, going back to what I discussed with quarterbacks, if we can project yardage accurately, then we could get a very good idea of how many touchdowns these players should be scoring and then compare that to their totals and get a pretty good idea of regression.
All right, can you explain air yards to, let's say, the viewer? And by the viewer, I mean me.
Yeah, so air yards, a lot of people are familiar with average depth of target. So if someone's on the 50 and they get a target at the 40-yard line, that's a 10-yard average depth of target. Air yards takes all of those numbers for every player and shows you how many yards the ball has traveled in the air. So whether it's a reception or not, we have an idea of where these players are being targeted on the field. And it's important because what Josh has found and through his work is that this is a wide receiver number. So it's important to know these numbers for wide receivers because take somebody like an Alex Smith, who he's always said he's a dump off passer and he doesn't throw deep. Well, that has to do with weapons. Quarterbacks can change. Wide receivers are going to be pretty consistent in where they see their target. So when we're looking for movement, looking to try to figure out how these offenses are going to change, if they get a Brandon Cooks infused into their offense, they're going to start throwing the ball down the field more. It's not going to be vice versa because the quarterback doesn't throw deep.
So would this lead you, let's say someone has a very elevated ADOT, but there's someone who played a very limited sample, someone like John Ross, for example, where you know what they're going to be doing on the field. They're going to be running fly routes, and if they can get open, someone's going to chuck them the ball. Is that something to actually bank on? I know for best ball it could be one thing, but if you're talking about season long, are those players that you would want to gamble on because there is upside to be had in terms of big plays, or can the numbers mislead you a little bit when the sample is so limited?
Yeah, I think we still want to be targeting the players that are going to have volume. So someone like a John Ross, the chances of him going above, say, a 15% target share are going to be pretty slim. So sure, he is going to have those boom weeks, but trying to figure out when they happen is going to be pretty difficult if he's not seeing more than 4 or 5 targets a game. I think where we can exploit this is maybe going after some of these quarterbacks. So I mentioned Jared Goff is a regression candidate, but now he has a Brandon Cooks on his offense. what that's going to do, it's going to really expand his range of outcomes because he's going to be throwing deep more. But if we have that quarterback that's in now what should be a more explosive offense, then maybe we can target him if we're in, say, a tournament style redraft league where we're banking more on upside than just maybe a 12-man league where you're playing a little bit safer. You're just trying to win a head-to-head contest every week. So again, going back to what's your league type? Are you trying to beat 1,000 people in a big championship tournament, or you just need to beat 11? So, and the quarterback can give you that upside maybe instead of just targeting that receiver alone.
Yeah, I think that's a good corollary to make for people out there. So if you're playing in your standard redraft fantasy football league where you're playing head-to-head with whoever, if you think about it in DFS terms, you basically want to roster a cash game team every week. Give yourself the highest floor possible. There's only one guy you have to be. You're right. Like if you're playing in like something like the Scott Fish Bowl or one of these like NFBC high stakes leagues, that you're going to need that outlier upside in order to win the really big prize, and therefore you would have to construct your team in a GPP style manner. If people want to follow Josh on Twitter, it's at FriscoJosh, and airyards.com is a great resource for all of this. And just looking at the leaders in air yards from last season, of the really big guys, like it's DeAndre Hopkins, Antonio Brown, and Julio Jones, the only three receivers with over 2,000 air yards. Then it's AJ Green, Mike Evans, Brandon Cooks, Alshon Jeffrey, Marvin Jones, Kenny Stills. So what I want to talk about is Marquise Goodwin, who's inside the top 10, finished with 1,547 air yards. Now, how much do you think that had to do with his role at the end of the season because Pierre Garçon was banged up, that he was able to achieve such lofty heights? Or is it just based on the role that he has in this offense, that where he started to get a few more targets near the line of scrimmage later on in the season, primarily he was just used as a deep threat?
Yeah, I think we know that Marquise Goodwin's a burner, and he's gonna be deployed in a role where he's asked to run some deep routes. I think the question is, like you mentioned, how much of a target share is he going to see with Pierre Garçon back on the team, with Garoppolo, who we only saw for 7 games last year, with Jerick McKinnon now in the mix, who I don't think his role should be that much different than Carlos Hyde's, but it's still a new player. And then people think that George Kittle is a player that can ascend to tight end. I think the target share is going to be a little hard to predict. Again, I like the offensive weapons, and I go back to a point I just made. If you are looking to get all of the upside in this offense, maybe it's better just to grab a Garoppolo in a tournament format rather than picking a Goodwin, who is going earlier than Garçon. That's probably the biggest reason that I haven't been buying up Goodwin, because I still think Garçon is the target leader on this offense.
So I guess if we're going to take a test case for any receiver to regress positively, it would have to be Julio, right? Like he garners a 28% team target share in the offense. He was third in air yards. He only scored 3 touchdowns despite all of the red zone targets that he ended up with. If this doesn't work out for Julio this year, is this going to be like a black eye for the analytics community?
The funny thing is it will be, because people will throw everything we've been talking about in our face. But again, there's such a small sample of NFL games over the course of an entire season that a player doesn't have to regress that year that we expect them to. It just, over the long term, that's going to happen. But Julio's case, he was historically bad in terms of scoring touchdowns, and I think it's just natural variance. Over 140 targets, 19 red zone targets. We've only seen a handful of players score as few touchdowns with as much volume as Julio saw last year. And I mentioned a little bit earlier, talking about Matt Ryan, that this offense was actually moving the ball quite well. What I said was they were third highest in terms of percentage of drives that made it to the red zone. So I think that's going to maintain. Second year, Steve Sarkisian, we saw this offense pop in their second year with Kyle Shanahan. Not to say that that is empirical evidence that that's how it works, but it's definitely worth noting. Matt Ryan a little more comfortable in this offense, and Julio he's going to continue to see the volume. I still think this is a very good offense. I'm buying Julio. I'm not worried about him. We talked about running backs going early. You can get Julio with the turn, pair him up with Odell Beckham sometimes, and have a ridiculous receiving core. So yeah, I'm buying Julio, and I'm buying him scoring let's say 8 touchdowns.
8 touchdowns. So if it was 7.5, you would bet the over?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was actually looking at some player props, and I think his over under is at 7. Don't quote me on that, but I remember looking at it and saying that I'm down for the over.
So what other top end wide receivers do you think that could rebound a little bit? Because I'm not even sure if we needed to see an AJ Green rebound. I think people are just sick of drafting him because he's been in the league so long, everyone's owned him.
Yeah, I mean, the volume's there. He's the number 1 wide receiver. There's nothing that points to him regressing, but he's been consistently great. So the fact that he's falling sometimes to the turn is a player that I'm buying as much as anybody, but a player that's going right around the same range as AJ Green that's actually due for some positive regression is Mike Evans. And if we look at Mike Evans' touchdown totals in terms of scoring rates, he's well above average overall and in the red zone, but his season rate is ping pong probably more than anybody. If we look at his red zone touchdown rates, 40% his rookie year, 12% his second year, 37% his third year, and then 17% last year. So it's not that he's quote unquote due, but just natural regression. His scoring rate should go back to at least his norm or the league norm, and we can see him. He's 15 red zone targets every year, and we talked about ADOT and air yards. This offense had 3 guys in the top 30 in terms of average depth of target. So they're going to stretch the field. That's going to expand the range of outcomes like we talked about. So is there going to be variance? Yes, but that also means a lot of upside, and I think Evans could be the beneficiary of that upside this year.
The problem with Mike Evans that I have is when you look at his 2-year trend in terms of team market share, he goes from one of the highest in the league. He's now under 25%, and I would really want an elite receiver of mine to be 25% or higher. I know it's a 1% difference. I'm playing semantics here, but when you see that, hey, Cameron Brate's going to be healthy the entire year. Chris Godwin is someone we need to get more involved in this offense. Maybe those targets come away from Adam Humphries, but those aren't the same type of routes. It seems like they have a bunch of the same guy on this team.
Sure.
And now if OJ Howard has a more expanded role this season, all of a sudden it's hard to divvy up the proper market share for Mike Evans that he has to convert on these. And I know he had the 14 ADOT last year. However, I'm not the most convinced that, like, for the first 3 weeks, it's going to be the Fitzmagic throwing him the ball down the field.
Yeah.
Those aren't going to be, like, catchable targets. Then you're going to bring back Jameis, who also doesn't really throw the most catchable targets either. That I just feel like he's in a bad situation because they have too many guys. If they could just cut down the number of guys that they had, Evans would once again be elite. But I think unless he has, I don't want to say an outlier performance in terms of touchdowns, but unless he scores like 13 or 14, I don't think you can consider him amongst the top end receivers. So I'm just going to end up passing, just banking on that. Like if he scores 8, he'll be a fine receiver. He might pay off value, but I think he actually needs to do that to justify where he's going.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with where you're drafting and what your early round teams look like, because I mentioned he is at that 2-3 turn, but if I'm getting him as my wide receiver 2 instead of my wide receiver 1, it changes a little bit. If he's going in the middle of the second round, probably you're paying a little bit of a price there. So I'm probably buying him a fair amount. Again, if it's between him and AJ Green, I'm definitely on the AJ Green side of it. But again, you mentioned they have a lot of the same guys, and I think that's by design. Jameis Winston throws at a deep rate higher than almost anybody in the league. The only one that we've seen higher was Deshaun Watson, and that's on a limited sample. So, yes, they do want to stretch the field, and it is going to lead to a lot of variance. But if you can hit that upside, I think that there's an opportunity there. But in terms of going back to we talked about regular 12-team leagues head-to-head, yeah, there's going to be some variance for sure.
Like, in that sort of format, I'd be far more comfortable taking Doug Baldwin in that situation, just knowing, yeah, he was at a 21% market share last year in the Seahawks offense, but I think the Seahawks team might end up passing even more because their defense is going to be, I don't want to say significantly worse, but not quite as good. The offensive line is not fixed, and then you lose Jimmy Graham, and then you lose Paul Richardson. There's just so many targets to go around in this offense. And I don't think that Brandon Marshall is stealing them away. Tyler Lockett might be healthy for like 2.5 games. That it's just hard for me to envision a scenario where Doug Baldwin doesn't end up around 30% of the team targets.
Is Brandon Marshall even going to make the team?
He might not. So then who are they left with?
Yeah, my only concern, and I agree, I think he blows away his career record in terms of market share. Where that translates to volume is up to Brian Schottenheimer. Like, do they just go full on try to pound the rock and ignore what they need to do regardless of game script? And Schottenheimer has proven over his career to be not reactive to game script like we would expect. He's one of those coaches that, even though we're losing a little bit or even though we're most efficient, we're going to run the ball. They spent a first-round draft pick on a running back. I think Baldwin still sets a career record in terms of targets. There could be a couple of weeks where even though he ends up at the end of the season a 140 target guy, that he sees some duds just because Schottenheimer likes to ruin our fantasy lives.
Well, I think it's just going to depend on what you make of the Seahawks overall. I just don't expect them to be all that good. Yes, they have Russell Wilson, who could be an MVP candidate. And I do think that Doug Baldwin is an excellent receiver, and getting rid of Jimmy Graham really improves the potential for him to score more touchdowns, almost like he did a few years ago. Then all of a sudden you go and get Graham. You don't need to use Doug Baldwin in the red zone anymore. They might have to go back to that. And he has a great first step, too. He's very good at jarring himself open in very limited spaces, despite not being a huge guy. So I think that game script will eventually have to dictate that they do have to throw a little bit more. Finally, the team they actually play in week 1, and Baldwin, not the greatest DraftKings play week 1 because they're playing Denver, but with Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders in the grasp they have of the market share of their team's offense, and now they have a competent quarterback throwing them the ball, are they underrated or are they just not good anymore?
I think they're fine. I mean, I talked about what we're looking for is volume, and volume is most consistent. And this has been one of the, if not the most concentrated passing attacks in the league. When both of these players are healthy, Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas, they're combining for almost 50% of the target share, and you just don't see that with other teams. I mean, Emmanuel Sanders, I think he played 12 games. He was still on pace for almost 130 targets. There's no one on this team where you think that's going to change. They have at least a competent quarterback now. I think Case Keenum played over his head last year. I think he played a ceiling, but he's a pretty obvious upgrade over what they've had in the past. And if you're going to give me 130 targets at a 8th round price, which is I think where Emmanuel's at right now, I mean, I love that. And even Demaryius, 150 targets, maybe 4th round. Sometimes if you're going wide receiver heavy, you're getting him as your wide receiver 3. I can't fathom a situation where I'm not buying these guys whenever they show up in my draft queue.
So in terms of regression at the wideout position, who are some guys to potentially target later that could potentially break out, that underachieved, or some higher end guys that just might not be up to snuff?
Yeah, I think one guy that I talked about volume and how it pertains to scoring rates, and someone who the fantasy community has liked to use as a punching bag is Devontae Parker, but we've seen his targets increase steadily over his career. He's had a relatively low scoring rate overall, but it was exceptionally low last year. He was just the 3rd player in the last 10 years to see over 90 targets and score less than 2 touchdowns. He just scored once last year. Ryan Tannehill, he's not a savior, but I think he's an upgrade over what they had in Jay Cutler last year. And Parker's finally going to get to be a real wide receiver 1 with Jarvis Landry out of town. So he's somebody to look at. On the other end of the spectrum, if we're looking at somebody that maybe might not perform as well as we expect just based on natural regression, Stephon Diggs scored at a ridiculously high rate inside the red zone. He was only expected, if we look at where his targets came from, how many targets he saw in the red zone. Historical averages would have said that he would have only scored between 2 and 3 red zone touchdowns. He scored 6. So we have a little bit of concern there just because, yeah, Dalvin Cook is going to be back. Sure, they have a new quarterback, but I don't know that the volume changes so much in the red zone. They have the 3rd lowest passing rate in the red zone, that Stephon Diggs can make up the volume to reconcile that touchdown rate. He would need to pretty much double his red zone volume to match his scores from last year if he bounces back to his red zone scoring average.
In terms of Devontae Parker, it seems like most of the fantasy community now has been burned long enough. It's been like 3 years in a row.
Yeah.
No one trusts the guy anymore, and everyone has just moved on to Kenny Stills. Is Kenny Stills someone to look at? Because by air yards, the guy ranks almost near the top.
Yeah, but if you're playing in redraft, when are you going to know when to start Kenny Stills? I'm buying him in best ball, but I don't have to figure out when to play Kenny Stills. I think Kenny Stills is a really good real receiver. I think he's going to have some really nice boom games. But what are the chances that Stills is someone that's going to see 7 or 8 targets a week? I don't know that happens for him, and I'm not going to be excited about trying to predict when or where that happens, whereas Parker – I mentioned, I think he's going to be the number 1 in this offense. It's not like you're paying a lot for him. I think they're separated by maybe 2 rounds, but you're still getting Parker in maybe the 9th round. And by then you're kind of throwing darts anyway. Everybody's roles are a little bit murky once you get past the 6th or 7th round. So I think from a redraft perspective, I'd rather have Parker.
Are there any wide receivers in new roles now that you can see, whether it's with a new coordinator or potentially with a new team or a new quarterback, that could take a massive step up in terms of volume overall? Because I just look at Michael Crabtree in Baltimore. Yes, his target share was very high with Oakland last year, but he's the only game in town with Baltimore. Now, they may never throw the ball. Who knows? But it seems like if they're going to throw, it's going to be to him.
Yeah, he's a player. He's going in the 6th or 7th round, and he's been, not only has he been a consistent guy in terms of target share, but he's been a really consistent red zone guy. And say what you will about Joe Flacco, but he's somebody that even for his career averages, really underperformed in the red zone. So that's just an offense that's due for some bounce back in terms of touchdown expectation. And even if Flacco is still bad, there's a chance that they get a little Lamar Jackson infusion, and that could mean a Michael Crabtree infusion as well.
Switching to tight ends to cap this off, what is the big difference between tight ends and wide receivers when you're looking at sticky stats year to year? Is it more of an emphasis on the red zone?
So it's actually interesting. If we look at their volume numbers, their average depth of target, their targets, their receptions, the stickiness is actually pretty similar. Where tight ends are different than wide receivers is they actually have a very consistent PPR points per game year over year, assuming they maintain their role, which most tight ends do. And I think what that has to do with, if we stay in the context of these sticky stats, is more so than any other position, tight ends actually have a positive correlation in terms of games played. So they're actually the least injury prone position, and that's why we see that consistent PPR scoring. They stay healthy. They tend to maintain their role, and we can actually be fairly confident that those tight ends that haven't changed teams or haven't changed offenses are going to score pretty consistently, which is surprising to say for any position. It's usually pretty hard to predict fantasy points.
Well, I guess the big one to look at would be Evan Ingram, just because you're getting so many guys back for the Giants. With Beckham back, there goes a whole lot of looks. With Barkley now in the mix, there goes even more looks. Like, you're not going to have that sort of market share that he did from a season ago. Does that mean Evan Ingram just drops back? Because the efficiency wasn't all that great.
Yeah, I mean, and now we talked about this offense is one that's going to want to run the ball a lot more than they did. And not only is Saquon Barkley going to change their offensive philosophy and how much they run, but he's also going to be competing for those shorter targets. Sterling Shepard is still there, so him and Ingram are slot guy versus tight end guy. Oftentimes they're competing for similar targets. So you have 3 guys competing for short targets while you have Odell. he's going to see his 27% market share. I don't care who's on a team, but you have a receiver like the Odells, like the Julios, like the Antonios. History has shown that they're just going to command a huge target share. And I don't care what their offensive philosophy is. They're going to get Odell the ball. So Ingram is definitely in trouble of a sophomore slump.
So when we think about target share at tight end, what about someone like Delanie Walker, who saw over 100 targets? Does that maintain itself with a new offensive coordinator and with a new head coach, or is Delanie just ingrained in this offense that he's going to continue to churn out these numbers year after year?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. Even if we see his volume drop a little bit, I do like Corey Davis to pop. I think Rashard Matthews is in a good spot with this offense changing philosophies. Even if his target share numbers drop, the passing volume in this offense was so low. Delanie was around the league leaders in terms of red zone target share last year, but because they were passing so little in the red zone, his actual red zone targets were middling. On top of that, we saw him not perform up to what we would expect, not just for Delanie, but compared to a league average in terms of those scoring rates. So he has positive regression on his side. He has offense that's going to be slanting towards the pass more than they have historically. So like I said, even if that target share drops a little bit, I think he's a tight end that if you do decide to go target tight ends in that 5th to 7th round range, he's a guy that could sneak into that top maybe 3 if one of those tight ends near the top don't perform as well as we'd expect.
Yeah, it just seems like Delanie Walker's budget Zach Ertz is the way that you would kind of go for. Instead of taking
I love that.
Instead of taking Zach Ertz at the end of the 3rd, early 4th, you can take Delanie Walker at the end of the 6th, 7th. And he's another guy that just gets no buzz. Like, people will want to take Trey Burton ahead of Delanie Walker. They're going to want to take Jimmy Graham. Oh, he's Aaron Rodgers throwing him the ball, so Delanie Walker can't possibly outscore him. And it seems that he's the guy who's falling down in the, at least in terms of early ADP. We'll see how that gets, but I can't imagine everyone's going to be out there like pounding the table for Delanie Walker. It's like, here's a guy that you can plug into your tight end and just play him out there every week, which is absolutely what you can do. There's just no sexiness that comes along with Delanie Walker. Plus, he's getting old too. You can't have old guys on your team. The two guys, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, nobody's going to ooh and ah when you put up that Delanie Walker sticker. And I think especially in live drafts, like that's a real psychological thing. People want to look cool when they make their pick, but your goal is to win. So avoid that trying to be cool factor, I guess.
Jack Doyle actually tied with Travis Kelce in terms of team receiving share at 24% of the Colts offense. Are you assuming Luck's going to be starting week 1? Because he's like throwing 20-yard passes right now.
Yeah, I mean, any quarterback in the NFL that could throw the ball 20 yards, I'm all over, right? No, but I mean, it sounds like they're expecting him to start. I'm buying shares of this offense because they are cheap relative to what we would expect if we had a fully healthy Andrew Luck. And you're getting everybody at a discount in this offense. Obviously, the concern with Jack Doyle beyond Andrew Luck is Eric Ebron, but we've seen this offense target the tight end at one of the highest rates in the league when Andrew Luck is healthy. They're an offense that has traditionally used 2 tight ends with Andrew Luck, and there's touchdown upside to be had with Luck in the offense. And I think probably Doyle's still the beneficiary over Ebron. I think he'll be the tight end one. And I think there's some upside here if Luck does play a full healthy season.
If we talk about the tight ends with over 20% target share in their offense from a season ago, it's Kelce, Doyle, Gronk, Ertz, Delanie Walker, Evan Ingram, who we've already talked about. The last guy there is Charles Clay. There's no one left in Buffalo. You got a stiff like Kelvin Benjamin out there, and who knows who else. Like, what is the potential fantasy upside for him? Is it like a good DFS week, or is he like, if I'm going to call Delanie Walker like the minor league version of Zach Ertz, is Charles Clay like the homeless man's version of Zach Ertz?
Oof, I don't know, man. 30% of 0 is still 0, and I think this offense is a big 0, right? I don't know that this is an offense that I'm particularly buying. I think this has like 20,015 Rams dumpster fire bad written all over it. I'm really concerned about their offensive line, their quarterback play. Shady fell off a little bit last year, and we don't even know if he's going to be in legal trouble or not. I just don't know if there's any way to open up this offense for potential. Sure, Clay's going to be up there in terms of targets, but I'm just a no-go on this whole offense, I think.
All right. Any final thoughts about this fantasy football season before we get out of here?
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit at the top of the show. I think there's a lot of opportunity to exploit the market right now because the trend has swung so much and people are copying the draft strategy so heavily, especially in these big tournament leagues, man. You have an opportunity to really go against the grain more so than we've seen in a very long time. And I think that if you do see those running backs flying off the board, I'm buying so much of these quote unquote falling wide receivers, but you can get a ridiculous value on guys that in the past have been top 3, 4, 5 picks. And I think that's how I'm formulating my draft strategies this year.
Well, I mean, that makes a lot of sense if you can actually select where you pick in the draft. But let's say you end up with the 4th pick. Does that mean you still go running back? Because in my top 200 rankings, which you can find on DK Playbook right now, I have 3 running backs as 1, 2, 3. Gurley, Bell, then David Johnson. Then the next 3 players in my top 200 overall are wide receivers. It goes Brown, it goes DeAndre, and then it goes Beckham. Like, I still want to have those guys. I'm comfortable taking those guys and figuring out running back elsewhere. But like, if you had the 4th pick, would you make it a wide receiver?
Ooh, I'm a little. I think you said Gurley, Le'Veon, and DJ are your top 3.
Yeah, in PPR.
Yeah, I'm kind of where you are there. I don't know that the Dallas offense is going to be in a spot where I'm just automatically grabbing Zeke with that high of equity. I agree with you. That's pretty much where my cutoff is. If I'm in those top 3 spots, I'm 100% taking a running back because it does give you such a big advantage over the field. And then I'm wide receivers probably all the way through the 1st round.
Oh, wow. Do you think David Johnson is being underrated?
100%. He was near the league in terms of backfield touch share last time he was healthy. I think it was around 80%. This offense doesn't have a wide receiver 2. It's kind of up for grabs. Is it going to be Ricky Seals-Jones? Is it going to be Kirk? Can Bryce Butler pop? But we don't know. So I think David Johnson is going to be the de facto number 2 wide receiver in this offense. I think he challenges for the league lead in targets at his position up there with Le'Veon. So I definitely think it's hard to say a top 3 picks being underrated, but I think you can make an argument for him as the 1.01.
Well, a lot of people just have Zeke ranked above David Johnson. I just don't understand that concept at all.
Me neither, especially in PPR leagues. We want those players that are going to be game script proof, and Zeke catches passes, but it's nowhere near the clip that we see David Johnson and Le'Veon Bell do it. So I probably have both Le'Veon and DJ over Gurley for the simple fact that they are such target monsters.
Right. TJ Hernandez. You can follow him on Twitter at TJ Hernandez, and they're going to think you're following Stewie Griffin, not TJ, but you are actually following TJ. Let us know what's coming up on 4for4.com from you and all the other great writers over there.
Yeah, so we're kind of moving from redraft to DFS. At least I am. DraftKings pricing for week 1 came out yesterday. So look for DFS. We're updating a lot of the long form studies we've done in the past, just getting ready for the season, preparing for NFL week 1. We'll be talking about those week 1 salaries, and we'll be dishing some preseason DFS as well. So it's DFS season now. We're ready. 4for4.com. Check me out at TJ Hernandez, and we're getting ready for the season, man. Week 1 ranking should be out in the next couple of weeks.
Is preseason NFL the most exploitable market left in like DraftKings fantasy?
It might be the only exploitable market left. I mean, it's close, really close to NBA in terms of you need to be around for lineup lock. You have to see who's playing how much, and you still see, 10, 15% of the field playing just starters. And a lot of these people that only play NFL aren't used to playing other DFS sports where you have to be around for lineup lock and making a ton of changes. The NFL's unique in that you don't have to do that as much. So people just aren't even used to the nuts and bolts of that in NFL preseason. So yeah, there's still some meat on the bone there.
All right, I'm Pat Mayo. You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at the PME. The draft kit is pinned to the top of all articles, which you can find on DKPlaybook.com in the description of this video or podcast. All of them in chronological order, too. I'm not giving you some like memento style stuff on the go. It's whatever came out latest is at the top, and you can work your way backwards. Some good stuff in there. Contributions from Evan Silva, Jake Seeley, Al Zeidenfeld, Rich Rebar, Garion and Cust. We're going to have Chris Meany on. We're going to add TJ to that list, too, and some even more big names coming up through the month of August to get you ready for the fantasy football season. Anyway, I'm Pat Mayo. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.
Pat Mayo Experience! Experience!